Jonathan Miller is a man who defies definition. From his controversial 1966 production of Alice in Wonderland to his recent series on atheism, Miller's view of the world is without a doubt original. Although he trained as a doctor, Jonathan Miller made his name across the globe as a director of theatre and opera, renowned for his interpretation of the classics.
Then must thou needs find out.
Not content with these varied achievements, he also presented acclaimed television series on the human mind and body. In 2004, 50 years after his first performance on television, Jonathan Miller took a step into the unknown to front an outspoken series on the history of disbelief, the first ever television program on the origins of atheism. Jonathan Miller, you've chosen to make this series now, but is disbelief something that has shaped the whole of your life?
No, it hasn't been a huge part of my life. It hasn't been a part of my life at all. For me, it's disbelief by default, really. It's only, as it were, by contrast to the people around me who I've increasingly discovered believe strongly certain things which I find totally absurd, that I have become self-consciously a disbeliever.
But does that change your relationship with them? Has that been difficult?
No, it's become slightly awkward more recently, when I find myself in a slightly evangelically atheist mood, in a way that I wasn't when I was young. I simply didn't know what religion was. I mean, I used to go to school prayers when I was at prep school, but as far as I was concerned, it was simply the first lesson of the day. And you spoke these curious couplets and the Lord's Prayer and so forth, but to me it was exactly like saying hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock, or those slightly dirty rhymes one used to recite in the loo at school, like temptation, 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 Dick Barton went down to the station, you know, and then you went on and did Latin. But I didn't know that it was religious, and I didn't know that it referred to a deity at all.
But are you now becoming more argumentative with people about it?
Well, yes, as time's gone on, and as religion has become publicly much more of an issue, and as fundamentalism is in the air, and as a great deal of sectarianism and violence has visibly broken out in the name of religion, I've become, I would say, evangelically atheist, although even then I'm reluctant to use this awful term atheism, in that how could I wish to apply a name to not believing in something any more than I would wish to apply a name to not believing in witches? I don't call myself an ahexist.
But it has to be defined by the opposite, which is belief. So why has belief clung on for so long then?
Oh, in general, you mean worldwide? I don't know. I mean, I think of it, and this is rather insulting, I suppose, and people will object to what I'm about to say, but I think of it as a serious thought disorder. Certainly, I think of it as a serious thought disorder amongst people who avail themselves of the conveniences of modern life. I can understand why people living really up against nature would actually start to invoke all sorts of notions of unfriendly agency at work. But in a sort of world in which we live, I think that it seems very odd to think that there is a disembodied intelligence at work.
Were the seeds of this disbelief about an afterlife sown in your childhood?
No, I mean, I don't think they were sown in my childhood. I grew up without anyone getting to me before my cognitive immune system was working. I mean, if you start implanting these nonsensical notions at a very early stage, everyone will believe what they're told, which is why you don't find Muslims in Iceland.
So, as a parent and a grandparent, what did you do? Was it a kind of
moral and religious education rather than, or what did you do with your own family?
Well, we did what we did. We taught them to be nice and to be decent and to be kind and not to be spiteful and not to be rude, but not because God would dislike them for it or that there will be a punishment in the hereafter, but simply because here you are on the raft of the Medusa. I mean, I'm talking about the Jericho painting. We're here on this raft, shipwrecked creatures, going nowhere, with no prospect of salvation, as there is in the Jericho picture, where you see the distant sail on the horizon, which will rescue these shipwrecked sailors. We're on the raft of the Medusa, and we'd better not eat one another. We'd better be kind to one another. It's the elementary social contract is simply a policy of prudence and decency which makes life possible.
And self-preservation.
And self-preservation, and also self-enjoyment and mutual enjoyment, which comes out of simply enjoying one's joint humanity.
Jonathan Miller's fascination with the human condition was evident as early as 1960, when he burst to fame with the wildly inventive revue Beyond the Fringe. With Alan Bennett, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, Miller helped to reinvent comedy with their sharp, satirical take on British life.
Perkins, sorry to drag you away from the fun, old boy.
That's all right, sir.
War's not going very well, you know.
Oh, my God.
Perkins?
Sir?
I want you to lay down your life.
Yes, sir.
We need a futile gesture at this stage. It'll raise the whole tone of the war. Get up in a crate, Perkins.
Sir?
Hop over to Bremen.
Yes, sir.
Take a shufti.
Sir?
Don't come back.
Right, you are.
Goodbye, Perkins. God, I wish I was going too.
Goodbye, sir. Or is it au revoir?
No, Perkins.
The instant success of the show presented Miller with a dilemma.
I can still remember walking the night streets of Edinburgh on the night that Beyond the Fringe was such a great success, when I was a doctor already, and my wife and I walked the streets thinking, oh, am I going to submit to the invitation? Am I going to go and, say, spend a year on the stage? Well, I did spend a year on the stage. I thought, well, a year out can't do any harm. And then another year out, and another year out. And what happened was that I find myself yielding to unsolicited invitations to have fun. And someone comes to the door with a frisbee, as I've often said, and I find myself unable to resist.
But there is all this thing about false memory that I'm sure that you're very well aware of, and I have here,
yes,
from the BBC archive,
yes,
from 1953, and this is from you to the BBC. Dear Sir, my friend Michael Bacharach and I wish to apply for a television audition. We specialise in parodies of radio, film and theatre, and also real life. We like to think we have an original slant, and we would be grateful if an audition could be arranged. Yours sincerely, J.W. Miller. P.S. I am 6'4", which might render me unsuitable for small screen television. I could, however, bend down. Now, you were 19.
Well, I was. I think that
you were rejected, of course, I have to say.
I was rejected until a year later, when I did get on television and bent down to accommodate myself to the small screen. But I think what it is that I was always a show-off when I was at school, because it was a way of being, in school, it was a way of getting out of being bullied. And I think probably Michael Bacharach and I, trying to get into television, having been on radio, simply wanted to show off more, and also it was a way of making pocket money in those days. I certainly wasn't I had no intention of mine to go into it professionally.
Intentional or not, Miller soon established himself as one of the most creative forces in British cultural life. Working as a director in theatre, opera and television, he became renowned for his interpretations of classical texts by Shakespeare, Verdi and Lewis Carroll. But Miller did eventually take a side route to medicine when, in 1978, he presented the seminal TV series The Body in Question. It was a broadcasting landmark. In 13 parts, Miller explained the workings of the human body, once even enlisting the help of an old friend.
Now, if I ask you to play it continually now, and to, without looking, to transpose it into a different key.
Swine.
What was happening as that transposition occurred? Were you having to revisualize the keyboard when it happened? Or revisualize your hand movements? Or did you simply reconceive the harmony as such?
I don't know. I don't know. I took the money. Kill me or something. I don't know what happened.
The series is perhaps best remembered, though, for showing the first ever autopsy on British television.
So one of the things that pathologists look for in an organ of this sort is what's called fatty change. When this begins to happen, the cells begin to alter their metabolism and fat begins to accumulate in the cells, and this produces a change which actually in the classical picture is called a nutmeg liver. For some reason, pathologists seem to have this tendency of
naming things after food and fruit.
The way you started to work your way back to medicine, at least on television, was through The Body in Question. There were hijinks there because you didn't even get permission to film the autopsy, did you? Which I think is you just went ahead and did it.
Well, I don't think we ever thought there was a question of there having to be a permission. It seemed to me, and it seemed to my producer, Patrick Uden, that autopsies are a necessary terminus to medical investigation, and therefore you show the medical investigation. And what I wanted to show was, what do you do when you use the dead body in order to find out what killed the owner of it, without, in fact, lasciviously attending to the interior. We simply said, well, look, this is what this is this orchard of organs you've got inside you, which give the game away after you've died, and they tell you why it is you died.
Was it a struggle to get that in all its explicitness on television?
It was very easy to get that on television in 1978. I mean, now I would have to do a cooking program, or a cooking program accompanied by a post-mortem, perhaps, or one which brought cooking and post-mortem activities together. Now it's got to be sensational, or it's got to be living room makeovers, or.
Are you very?
I think television is
despondent about television.
I'm very despondent about it, indeed. I mean, even. I'm to some extent dissatisfied with the atheism program, because not through any fault of my producer, but the atmosphere which would forbid what I was able to do when I did The Body in Question, which was to speak to the camera sometimes for 7 or 8 minutes without a cutaway, without an illustration, without a joke, without a. Now, they come in very, very small sound bites, and anything extended and philosophical is completely impossible on television now.
But it is one thing, in a sense, having a 7 or 8 minute conversation or listening to you here. Perhaps the audience at home has too many other things going on to take.
Well, I mean, they didn't in the old days, and they had just as many things going on when they would listen to Isaiah Berlin for an hour talking about freedom and its betrayal. And then went on and on and on, unscripted, it wasn't written down, he talked at great speed and went on for an hour, and people were glued to the set. It's completely impossible now. The idea of an uninterrupted discourse without cutaways, or without the camera doing what it's doing now, moving slowly and visually interestingly backwards and forwards.
But there's nothing wrong with being visually interesting.
Well, no, but I think that there's a notion that unless it's visually interesting, it cannot be intellectually engaging. The fact is that if it's intellectually engaging, you can keep the camera dead still.
To most people, Jonathan Miller is the archetypal intellectual, a champion of clear thinking. And in a new world order, which he views as confused and hypocritical, Miller feels more than ever that clarity is paramount. Yet Jonathan Miller is uncomfortable with the intellectual label. He considers himself simply to be fulfilling a responsibility everyone has, to think about the issues of our times.
A British intellectual is either a rare beast or a beast that feels they have to hide.
Well, I mean, I'm as reluctant to refer to myself as an intellectual as I am to refer to myself as an atheist. It's odd that there should be a special word for taking an interest in what goes on. And that's all I think.
But it's only seen. I'm using it in a sense, the way that some people use it in a kind of behind their hand derogatory sense. That in somehow, it's you're too much. You get above yourself. You get full of yourself, and it's an odd thing because it doesn't exist in Europe, and to a certain extent, it doesn't exist in areas of America either.
No, it doesn't. It's a curious English prejudice against thinking clearly or thinking speculatively. And it's often thought to be showing off or getting above yourself. And it's the sort of thing, you're a swot. Whereas, as you say, in large parts of Europe, thinking clearly and constructively about how things work is rather commendable. And also in America. I mean, there are large parts of America in which it's also suspect because it leads to disbelief, atheism, and perhaps even not being patriotic. Certainly someone like Bush and so forth and his hideous entourage at the White House would think that intellectuals were, in fact, what had brought America to its pretty pass at the moment.
But the idea that this war that we're in the midst of at the moment, firstly, the idea that it's a clash of civilizations is this cliche or this phrase that is used, but it is a clash of extremities, isn't it, on both sides?
Well, it's a monstrous condescension on our part, on England and America's part, to think that we are bringing the gift of democracy to these people, and that therefore we must stick with it until we have given them the gift which they have never yet tasted, considering in fact that we in the West are responsible for having carved up these butcher's slices of the Middle East in the first place. And then all the lies and pretensions about how we have rid this country, Iraq, of this monstrous dictator. Why do we never make any efforts to rid other countries of monstrous dictators before? The Americans say, oh, well, look, we actually won the war for you. We attacked Hitler and brought him down. They had no interest in Hitler until Pearl Harbor occurred. Well, what about Mugabe? What about all these monstrous dictators in Central Africa? What about the Sudanese government, about whom we're so unwilling to take any action on behalf of the people in Darfur?
But do you believe in preemptive action to rid the world of these kinds of people?
Well, it may not have to be preemptive action of the sort that is invoked by Mr. Blair or the self-righteous Christianity of both Blair and Mr. Bush.
Both leaders do invoke God.
Yes, they do, and I just think God should be left out of it. I mean, it's quite enough that something insufferable is going on to other human beings. I think that we have consistently neglected and refused to take action on behalf of genocidal initiatives. Here we are fussing about the Turks' entry into the European Union, and it's conditional upon them alleviating this crime of adultery. How about the 1.5 million, if not more, Armenians that were killed during the First World War by the Turks? Until they've apologized for having done that, I think we should actually have some doubts about admitting them to a supposedly civilized West, as we like to think of it. And yet it was in the civilized West that the monstrous actions were conducted against 6 million Jews and against almost as many million Poles and gypsies and homosexuals. Until we come to terms with the notion of the atrociousness of our own species, I think it is offensive to say that we are bringing civilization and democracy to this country or that country, when you consider the capacity of any country to become monsters.
And of course, as it were, the kernel for a lot of this the maelstrom at the moment is, of course, the Middle East. Is there an answer to the Middle East? I mean, it's just in 10 seconds.
I'm sure there's no answer. There's no answer to the Middle East. There are more or less prudent procedures and prudent hesitations, and then I think prudent provisions of things that might restrain monstrous actions. I think that a lot of that could have happened in Rwanda. We know that it could have happened with more efficiency and humanity in the former Yugoslavia. But there is a curious reluctance to take action on behalf of people suffering at a distance greater than the block down the street. It's elsewhere. It's else whom. And therefore it doesn't directly concern one. The difficulty of getting Whitehall to understand what the Jews suffered as late as 1940, and you still have aristocratic households in this country where you'll hear people at table saying, well, basically the Jews brought it upon themselves. And there's always someone prepared to say that the Armenians brought it upon themselves, and that, really, you get a tremendous amount of exaggeration, and we've really got to take exaggeration into consideration. Well, what's it? Simply an elaborate, euphemistic way of saying, well, let's carry on with dinner.
Is there still anti-Semitic behaviour, do you think, in this country?
No, I don't. I think anti-Semitism, I mean, I'm Jewish myself with no particular enthusiasm for it, and then I have no enthusiasm for ethnicity or religion at all. I'm a Jew, as it were, by default, in the sense that someone's bound to call me a dirty Jew at one time or another. I don't think I'll suffer as a result of it in any serious way, in the way that my now dead relatives in Lithuania must have suffered, the ones I don't know, whose graves I saw when I went and visited it about 10 years ago. No, it's simply, it's a form of language. There's what I call the high bat squeak of anti-Semitism, which you hear in England, little tiny phrases which refer to our friends of the chosen people or our friends of the Hebrew persuasion. It's much more just simply snobbery in England rather than a vicious form of homicidal and genocidal racism that you get in continental Europe.
Now in his 8th decade, Miller's energy looks far from disappearing. With a revival of his Così fan tutti at the Royal Opera House, a recently published book of his art, and exhibitions of sculpture, Miller has continued with well-loved pursuits, while also exploring new territory.
We are now entering your next decade, and now you've turned to the visual arts, particularly to sculpture and collage. What has created this new energy?
Well, I was surprised to find myself doing metal work the other day.
Don't tell me it's an accident.
Well, it is an accident, really. I didn't intend to do it. What happened, again, was someone offered me the opportunity. And the opportunity would not have been taken up unless I had had long-standing interests in what that metal sculpture has in common with interests that I had already developed 40 or 50 years ago. I've been taking abstract photographs for more than half my life without thinking of it as being art. I just carry a camera around with me almost wherever I go. And I like abstract formats of reality. And then I drifted into saying, well, wouldn't it be nice to do some of these things? I would skulk around Italian towns late at night, with a Stanley knife and rip stuff off of the walls and then reassemble them. And then I began doing metal work because someone said, have you ever tried doing it with metal?
What did someone say to you?
When he said to me, I said, well, I can't weld. And this man, this was a very nice man in Santa Fe when I was doing opera. He said, if you can light a cigarette without burning your nose, you can weld. And it turned out that was what happened. And he taught me how to weld in a couple of hours.
Are you terrified of boredom?
No, I'm not terrified of it. I mean, I am frequently a victim of it. I descend into these things which the medieval theologians referred to as accidia, long periods of staring sightlessly at nothing and wondering what on earth is worth doing. And then something would get me going again. Accidia and activity are alternating forms of my own existence. I don't dread one and relish the other. It's just that I find myself alternating between accidia and activity.
And do you have more energy now than you have when you were 40?
Well, it's an interesting question. I sometimes think I do, and I think I'm probably sort of cleverer and more active and more clear thinking now than I was, because I know much more, I've seen much more, and I've kept my mind. I forget names and have these things called senior moments, as we all do. Well, you haven't had them yet,
No,
but
I have.
But I think I'm doing much better work than I was 25 years ago. Certainly in the theatre, I look at the things that I've done on the stage now, and I stand back from them and say, actually, that's probably better than I did when I was much younger.
So what does Jonathan Miller do next?
I'll go on doing the selfish things that I do, in amusing and entertaining myself and living with my family and seeing my grandchildren, my granddaughters grow up, worrying about their future and worrying whether they will in fact be endangered by the atrocious risks of now terrorism. I know I'll probably go on doing much the same sort of thing that I've gone on doing, yielding to temptation by being invited to do things and saying, oh yes, okay, well I think that would be quite interesting. I get asked much less to do things now than I used to. I mean, in England I don't get asked to do anything. I work abroad most of the time now. I've never been asked to work at the National Theatre, and only recently at Covent Garden.
Is that a sadness?
Well, it seems rather odd that when I'm doing work, which of course the English don't know because it occurs in the cut-off continent elsewhere, that I'm actually doing work which is, I think, much better than I was doing 30 years ago. So it seems rather odd that I don't get invited to do things here in my own country.
Maybe you're about to get your next big break.
No, I think probably not. I'll go on doing the metal work as long as I don't burn my nose.
Jonathan Miller, thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you.